Okay, so I think we're live. Good evening, everyone. My name is Natasha. I'm the Europe organizer, temporarily filling in for Emma, who normally does this job, who is on sabbatical. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. It's very exciting. We have people joining from 24 countries signed up and more than 300 of you, which is great. And I've already seen lots of different people kind of signing in from different countries around Europe and also in the States. So yeah, I would first of all like to introduce the panel that I've got. So I am here tonight with Asad Raymond. Asad, would you like to introduce yourself?
Not unmuted. I'm unmuted now, sorry. Apologies for that. Hi everyone, my name's Asad Raymond. I work for Friends of the Earth. I lead their climate justice work, but my background is in social justice and anti-racism work, over 30 years of sort of grassroots struggles against the far right and racist violence and police violence in the UK.
Thanks, Asad. I'm also joined by my colleague, Nico, who is joining us from France. Nico, would you like to say hello and introduce yourself?
So hi, everyone. I'm Nico. I'm a campaigner for 350 based in France and working in France, so helping moving our campaigns and mobilization here. And I've also been involved for the last 20 years in the global justice movement and the World Social Forum process, which has been a space where there were many discussions on how to make different agendas and struggles converge. So that's a part of my background too.
Thanks, Nico. So as you can see, it's just the three of us that are on this call, but I have some colleagues that you can't see that are helping to moderate and collect your comments as they come in. So there are two ways that you can contribute and share comments or questions to this webinar. You can, first of all, you can comment in the chat box below the webinar, and to do that you need to have a YouTube account and be signed into that, and then create a channel. You should be able to see how to create a channel and click on that. If that's too faffy for you, we're also collecting comments coming in on Twitter, so if you use the hashtag 350Europe, that'd be great. And if you could carry on signing in and saying where you are in the world, that would be awesome. It's very exciting to see the mixture of people coming in from all over, lots of different places. As well as we go along, as you sharing your questions and comments, we would like to get your ideas for the way that the climate movement can respond to the rise of the right and individual actions that people can take. And so please feel free to share them as we go along. I'll actually be collating all of the suggestions into a resource. So if you have links to particular groups in different countries that you think are interesting or anything, please do share it with us. It might seem like there's lots of stuff coming through, but we will go back through it and try and make it digestible and shareable. So Nico is going to be, first of all, talking through and summarizing his blog that he's written on the connection between the climate crisis and the rise of the right. And then we'll take some questions and discussion points around that. And then Asad will be joining in and we'll be talking about, maybe picking up on some of the things that people have already said and also making suggestions for the kind of actions we can take. Then we'll have some more questions and discussion. And then I will be talking a little bit about how some advice that I got from one of my colleagues in the States about how we need to kind of calm everything down and ground ourselves, because there's a lot of action happening at the moment. There's an awful lot of heat, but not very much light. People are responding very quickly and not acting kind of strategically, and we need to conserve our energy and be in this for the long haul. So I'll be talking a bit about that and setting some things for people to go away and think about in their groups or with friends. And we'll have a bit more of a discussion at the end. We should be done in a little bit more than an hour. It depends how quickly we go and how much you have to say. Also, thanks to everyone that commented on the blog that Nico wrote. Hopefully we'll cover lots of the kind of points and themes that came out of that in the conversation, but yeah, this is just the start of this work. So I'm just going to start talking about the purpose of the webinar, and then we will go over to Nico. So we were moved in the 350 Europe team to respond to Donald Trump's election and the Muslim ban, and think about actually the rise of the right on our continent and what this means for our work, basically. It's a time of great change, and the rise of the right here in Europe is more visible than ever before, but it's not a EU problem. It's been growing for a long time. And across the continent, we've got elections coming up with Le Pen in France. We've got UK Brexit and the UK Independence Party gaining a lot of traction. In Sweden, we've got right-wing parties affecting government policy. And the right is basically sowing division and hatred. They're dismissing science, climate science first and foremost, and reinforcing the existing inequalities that there are. And a lot of those go back to the colonial era when a lot of Europe was founded. We know we need to respond as a climate movement for the sake of our common humanity and the success of our struggle. I wanted to share, this is something that I really feel when thinking about this stuff. It's a quote commonly attributed to Lilla Watson, who was an Aboriginal activist, but I think it actually came from her group. It's, if you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. And I really feel like that. This isn't about how we need to act on behalf of other people who are suffering. It's about how all of our struggles are intertwined, and we're not going to win unless we can kind of bring them all together. So this webinar is not going to be about how to solve racism or about how to make our movement more diverse. We don't have all the answers. We know that we're going to make mistakes as we try and find a way forwards, but we need to try. And for 350, at least, this is the start of a conversation. We've already learned that trying to do things in a hurry is not a great approach. We reacted to the Muslim ban very quickly, tried to pull this webinar together very quickly, didn't leave ourselves enough time to consult with activists that were affected, and we should have taken our time with it a lot more. But thanks to everyone that helped, I got a lot of help and support with this. So that's some kind of basic framing. And I would like to hand over to Nico now to kick this off and to talk about why we think that it's so important for the climate struggle that we respond.
Yeah, thanks again, Tasha. I will maybe start with a little background on how we came to writing this blog. That, yeah, even if I'm the author of this blog, was also a collective effort from the European team at 350, and based in many conversations that we've had for a while now, based both on doubts and reflection that we have on our own work, and also attempts and experiences that we've been involved in working with more intentionality with grassroots communities and groups impacted by climate change. The question, of course, is not new. As I said before, I used to be very involved in the global justice movement, and 20 years ago, in the World Social Forum or in all the G20, G8 counter summit, everyone was talking about the idea of the convergence of struggles. Now it has changed a little. We are rather talking about intersectionality, which is the idea that our identities are plural. We are not defined by one single trait, by one single quality, but several of them. And all those traits, they cross or they intersect where we are, and they shape ourselves, our identity. And ourselves are, of course, more than one or two of these traits. They are the combination of all those traits. Let's take myself, for instance. I'm not just a man, I'm not just white, I'm not just upper middle class, I'm not just living in the global north, I'm not just heterosexual, cisgender. I'm all of these together, combined. And this is what defines my identity and helps to understand where I'm situated in the different layers of domination and interaction that build those domination. And the shift from speaking in terms of convergence of struggles to speaking in terms of intersectionality is quite important and comes with new challenges. Of course, there's something in common between this initial idea of the convergence of struggles and intersectionality. The main thing that they do have in common is that they both break with strategies of, let's say, the historic Marxist progressive movements, which was based on the assumption that there would be a primary struggle and one collective actor of change. The primary struggle would be the class struggle, and the collective actor of change would be the proletariat. And then there would be many secondary struggles against colonialism, for gender equality, against racism, etc. And the idea was then, to sum up, let's first get rid of the structures of capitalism, and then we can deal with colonialism, with feminism, and with all the other issues. And there was a first breakthrough in that perspective with the feminist movement, the environmental movement, and of course also the anti-colonial, decolonial movement, which shared, like, or mainstream the idea that there is no primary struggle and then secondary struggles, but that those struggles are all equally important. Yet, in that convergence of struggle, or those attempts to make those struggles converge, many causes, many approaches were missing because they were not visible, because they were excluded, because actually within a class or within a race or within a gender, there can be domination or people dominating one another, precisely because our identity is not just based on the class or the race or the gender, but all of it combined. And I think intersectionality puts the stress on those who suffer from several forms of domination and exclusion and want to be actors of change, of course, and like bring also the idea that even in our movements, there are people who dominate others, and that those who dominate others within the movement cannot be the one defining the agenda. And so intersectionality eventually has to do with individuals, not as giving up on collective organizing. That's pretty much the opposite. It's collective organizing based on those identities and how they intersect. So that's the background, like maybe political or intellectual background to that thinking. Then came, of course, the election of Trump, and among his most outrageous decision, the so-called Muslim ban. And then talking to one another within our team and with many partners, we realized that actually Trump is a very good example. He embodies somehow why intersectionality matters. Why? Because it's not surprising at all that he's at the same time racist, sexist, violent, climate denier, that he denies the right of people to self-determination, that he's organically connected to the fossil fuel industry. It actually shapes a coherent set. And this has implications for our strategies. Namely, we won't be able to fight accurately against Trump and his world if we don't find ways to articulate the fight against climate change or climate denialism or against the fossil fuel industry with a fight against racism, with a fight against gender oppression, with a fight against class oppression, etc. So Trump somehow embodies a reversed intersectionality, which calls for a movement that articulates different fronts and different struggles. And to be maybe a bit more specific or concrete, this is something that groups working on human rights know very well, right? They know that fundamental rights are both interconnected and that they are global, which means that one infringement against one right is not only an infringement against all rights, it's also an infringement against the rights of all, of everyone. So if our horizon is climate justice, then we have to acknowledge that it won't happen without gender justice, without racial justice, without social justice. Or to put it the other way around, you might remember that back in Copenhagen in 2009 at the COP15, which happened just after the financial crisis, many of us were saying, if climate was a bank, it would have been bailed out. That was our punchline. And it was a way for us to highlight the fact that states know how to be proactive and move huge amount of public money in certain specific occasions. And the idea would be to expand this slogan a little further. It's not only if the climate was banked, then the issue would already have been solved. We can also say that if Katrina or Sandy, so Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, or like the storms that affect Bangladesh, or the drought that affect many countries in Africa, were actually affecting gated communities of rich white people, let's say in Florida or in France, then we would also have had already answered the issue of climate change in another way than sending the troops, as it was done in Katrina, in New Orleans, or in New York after Hurricane Sandy. So that's a way to highlight the fact that we are not equals when it comes to climate change. There are some people who suffer more from climate change than any other, even if it's a global issue, even if it affects every corner of the planet, of the Earth. And that, of course, the current answer, which is to send the troops, is not compatible with climate justice. So the third thing that I wanted to address briefly as a way to open the conversation with Assad and with you all is what should we do from within the climate movement based on those observations. The first obvious conclusion is that we can't keep on working in silos or bubbles, as we call them now. Breaking those silos or those bubbles is probably a long task, but it begins with a very simple way, is to start organized meeting with groups from communities that are directly affected by other issues than climate, acknowledging the fact that they intersect, and that there are people who are affected by both state racism, gender oppression, and climate change at the same time, and that we could start from there to organize and build a movement to tackle Trump, his world, and the fossil fuel industry. Of course, it won't be immediate, and it's a process that might take a while. At least, for instance, in France, where we haven't started it yet. There are other regions in the world where it's very different, of course, it also implies knowing how to show solidarity wherever it's needed, even if it's not directly related to climate. And I think the main horizon would be, as our colleague Hoda Baraka said when she reacted to the Muslim ban, we know that climate change has no boundaries, and we won't neither have boundaries. So, of course, there are questions that come with that. The first could be, and some of you raised those issues in the comments to the blog, isn't it a diversion from our work? Shouldn't we focus on climate because that is what we are good at, and that is our focus, and that is our identity as 350? But actually, there could be another question. Isn't it the only way to really achieve climate justice, to tackle climate justice as an issue that intersects with other issues? Or the question should then probably be, how do we make sure that those alliances and intersections that we need to build and seek and increase will be meaningful and effective? And I think that's pretty much what we would like to start discussing with you all during this webinar, of course, but hopefully also as much as possible in the daily work that we do and in our campaign and our organizing.
Great, thanks, Nico. I don't think we've had loads of questions come in, so maybe it's just that everyone is on the same page about this, and that they actually, that you actually just want us to start talking about and sharing ideas about actions that we can take. And if that's the case, then we can totally do that. One thing though that has come up is a bit of a discussion about intersectionality. So I wonder if it's just worth taking the time to define that. Nico and Assad, I don't know if either of you wanted to have a go at defining what that term means.
I can go, but Assad, don't hesitate to jump in. Intersectionality is a term that was created, I think, 25, 30 years ago by an Afro-feminist scholar and activist. And the idea was really to highlight the fact that, our identity is several folds, right? We have, there are several layers that shape our identity, whether our sexual orientation, our gender, where we come from socially, so our class or our social origin, our race, where we are based in the world, and many other things, our like cultural capital. And they all of them form our identity. And our identity is then, of course, part of the broader society, which interacts with us, or we interact based on this identity with others, and those identities that do intersect. So it's really the idea of crossing, of coming together at some point, which is oneself. The place where the intersection happens is oneself, yourself, myself, ourselves. When we interact with others, those different layers that intersect on ourselves will contribute to define our place, role in the mechanism of operation of domination that do shape and run the society.
Can I just also maybe jump in?
Please jump in, Assad.
So just to build on what Nico said there, many years ago we used to talk about this as being our understanding of the world. Some people would have an understanding of the world of why things were as they were, and say this is because the economy is as such, and our relationships with each other and the way that society is constructed is primarily about a relationship about class, and that is the way in which we must look at the world. And if we want to solve the ills of the world, if we resolve that class crisis or conflict, we would subsequently have resolved everything else. And many different groups, but from Black organizations, women's organizations, groups working on lesbian and gay rights, said that's not actually the way that society is simply constructed. It's not simply on the issue around class, that things like race, gender, sexuality interplay, and that's what has created the society that we want, that we live in. And if you want to deal with these ills of society, you can't simply have this very narrow view about how and what is the most important. So if society is constructed on this intersection between race, class, and gender, our movements must also be constructed on the same kind of premise, that you can no longer just say, well, the women's fight is over there, and that's only for those people who are interested around women's rights, and the anti-racism fight is over there, and that's for Black people, and I'm interested in, workers' rights, and I'm going to fight on workers' rights. Actually, it came back to it. If we win, we all win, and if we lose, we all lose. And that, so now race, class, gender becomes intersectionality, or an intersectional approach to looking at power, how the society is constructed, and also helps us look at the lens of how we should begin to organize to have more power.
Thanks, Assad. I'm just looking at the other kind of comments and questions coming in, and we've got a few. So Thorsten Bierman says, we're all worried about the ecosystem. Initiatives need to unite forces and change the system, otherwise we just repair it a little and we won't get big enough, fast enough, which I think is a good point. Olivia Linander says, I invited people to watch this who are active in anti-racist movements. I'd be glad to hear any people who are here from intersecting movements and how they think the climate movement could respond. Absolutely. I think Assad's going to talk about that a little bit in a bit. I've been trying to ask people for their input before this, and will be afterwards as well. And just got another comment that I've seen from Kitty Dutton saying climate activism can justify support of other movements, perhaps by acknowledging that women and non-white people will be disproportionately affected by climate change impacts, which I think is a really good point. Nico and Assad, do either of you want to come in and say anything on any of those points?
I'm happy to, if you want. I think we all recognise now that there are being some major problems with the climate movement, and I think many of us in maybe the more sort of climate justice end of the climate movement I've tried to analyse those and say, if we want to build power, if we want to win, and if we want a vision of a society and a world that lives within its limits and is fair and just, we have to accept the mistakes we made as the climate movement. First and foremost was the framing of climate. If the imagery of climate is about polar bears and icebergs and talks about temperature levels in sort of percentages and temperature and takes away people, then it speaks to a very narrow audience of people and engages that very narrow audience of people. And one of the, I think, many criticisms that people have tended to make about the climate movement is it's class-based, that it's primarily speaks to an affluent, white, middle-class kind of constituency, and that delegitimizes it. It pits us against social justice movements, it pits us against the unions, and also politicians are able to say, well, actually, this issue doesn't have broad-based support. Secondly, I think it also does a real disservice because without justice at its core, we actually perpetuate the lie of the climate crisis. So if you say, we must end fossil fuels, full stop, that's true. But if you know that the climate crisis and the impacts of 1.5 and of breaching of 1.5 and what impacts it will have on the global south, you are basically deciding that the frame you are going to use is about what's acceptable within your political space rather than what is right through the lens of justice and what the science says. So I think just starting to have to deconstruct that climate movement and say, where is the anchor? Well, the anchor is actually with people who are being most impacted. Who are we accountable to? We're accountable to the people who are being most impacted. And yes, we are all affected by climate change. And the analogy I know a lot of people have always used is we're on the Titanic and the Titanic has hit the iceberg, the climate iceberg. And I say that's absolutely true. But the problem is that the rich industrialized countries are sitting on the top of the Titanic, sipping cocktails, listening to the orchestra. And it's the poor, the marginalized, the indigenous who are in the hold already drowning and then finding that the hold is, welded shut and you can't get out. So if you don't accept that, then the question of whose voices you are speaking for and who you're speaking with becomes a much more sort of different conversation. And I think the climate movement has tried to really address that. I think 350 has tried to do a lot. And of course, climate justice groups like Friends of the Earth, saying the climate movement, where it's been, has been partly why it's failed. And unless it radically changed that, we'll never have a chance of winning.
We've got another comment that I've seen saying that basically that the Muslim ban has nearly no collections with climate change, and I can understand people would think that. Says, I get racism makes fighting climate change more difficult, but we should not directly fight certain racist acts. I don't know. I mean, I personally think that the argument that we're kind of trying to make here is that actually the world that we want to see means that we need to do everything quite differently. And there's a really good Naomi Klein piece that I will try and share in the chat box at some point, where she basically talks about Black Lives Matter and climate change and makes the connection between those two things really, really clearly. If we stop caring about some people, if some people are just less important in the discourse, whether it's people in the global south or people are suffering from pollution, it becomes much easier to put other interests ahead of people in general. And then you've got this kind of hierarchy where you've got basically the hangover from colonialism, and you've got white supremacy kind of infecting everything that happens. And so the thing in my mind, it's a domination of nature and a domination of different types of people, and it is the same forces. I mean, don't forget that it's, there are lots of kind of big business interests invested in funding people like Trump that are also they're fueling this kind of rise of the right and the kind of hatred that goes with that, and at the same time they're profiting from the fossil fuel industry massively. So I think that these things are bound up. Assad, I think you want to come in.
Yeah, Natasha, just to build on what you're saying, of course, look, we've got to, even if you coming purely from a climate perspective, from an environmental perspective. You don't really care about anything else. The big question, of course, is, climate is a global problem. For a global problem, you need to start to be able to address it. You actually need principles of solidarity, right? You need to be able to have that concept of, it's a global problem, we need to address it, we need to act together. There has to be some basis of fairness and justice about it, otherwise nobody's going to act. And those are the very same principles that are undermined by all of these sort of bans. That the very moment you need the world to act more in solidarity together, people are saying, let's build walls and fences, as if, all of these global problems, inequality, migration, climate change, you can section yourself off from. So that's, I think, a huge challenge. Now, even if you didn't care about all of those things, and I think we have to take a responsibility. You look at the 7 countries that are being banned: Yemen, Somalia, Sudan, Iraq. Look, climate change has its fingers over everything there. Why are people being driven there? You talk about the conflict in Iraq, around what's driven the war in Iraq. It's been overwhelmingly about access to oil and fossil fuels and dirty energy. You see what Donald Trump is saying in terms of about seizing Iraqi oil. You look at the droughts that have taken place in the Horn of Africa, in Yemen, impacted by climate change, worsening inequality. You think about Syria, where a drought 5 years before the conflict, killed 80% of all livestock, drove nearly 2 million people from rural areas into urban areas, contributed to the climate, to existing sort of conflicts in that area. So I think we're living in an interconnected world, and unless we actually deal with the Muslim ban, all these wars, it's not just about those countries. When we look at the climate crisis, the International Organization of Migration is talking about 1 in 30 people will be displaced from their homes by the year 2050. That's less than 30, that's about 30 years from now. That's an incredible amount of people. What's going to happen? Either we're going to have machine guns and warships around northern countries, or we have to look at a different way that the world is organized. And that's why the Muslim ban has to be an important fight for the climate movement.
If I can jump in.
Yeah. I'm just going to go to Nico quickly, and then we're going to move on and let Assad speak, and then we'll take more questions after that. As ever, please keep coming with your questions in the chat and on Twitter, and we will pull them together and try and respond. Nico.
Yeah, I wanted to address maybe 2 of the comments that were made on chat box. One is, shall we act upon intersectionality first in order to show that we're all plural and climate change goes beyond identities? And the second is, I think stressing moral issues more is correct, but it should be as non-partisan as possible. Don't forget the majority of Republican voters support action against climate change. And I think that somehow those comments are related, and they would come with 2 answers. The first one is, I think a good way to begin with is to, based on what Assad said, kind of deglobalize climate change and recount that it's also a local issue, that it's happening in very concrete and local territories. So it's not just about molecules, it's not just about global processes of negotiating global agreements. It is a daily issue in very specific territories. And starting from those territories is a good way to stop talking in a very abstract way of both climate change and what intersectionality might be, because that's happening. And then you see who's affected by climate change, who's organizing to fight against climate change, and how they already include other issues and other alliances than just climate groups. And then the second is, it doesn't mean at all that we should stop campaigning if we're not campaigning with people who are also fighting for gender equality, racial equality, class equality, or whatever. It's also important to reckon that precisely because of that intersectionality, it's important to leave some room for some of the alliances to be built on a specific a target, on a specific objective, on a specific location. Take the fight that is happening in the north of the USA against the Dakota Access Pipeline project. This fight probably includes people like veterans that were fighting abroad. It might include people who are not like at home feminists, for instance. Yet it's important to win this fight, but it doesn't mean that building alliances with people that are maybe not intersectional themselves in this in their practices mean that we give up on the other fight. It's just important to know how to build alliances on specific objective and broader alliances on the general goal.
Thanks, Nico. There are some really good comments coming into the chat. We're not going to have time to go over all of them now, but I'd like to go to Assad now if you'd like to say anything else in response, Assad, and also to say the kinds of actions that you think that we can take to respond as a climate movement and the kinds of things that climate activists can be doing.
Okay, so first of all, I think it's really, thank you for this webinar. I think it's really important because, of course, Brexit, Le Pen, Trump has not happened overnight, and they've been decades in the making. And so, you know, we know that popular extreme right-wing nationalism, this moment of economic uncertainty, the blaming of the other, and how that process takes place. And there's a lot of lessons for us to look at history, look at how we've defeated them before, but also maybe reflect on, you know, why we've not been able to build a stronger alternative. You know, what were we good at saying no to, but what weren't we so good at saying yes to? So it's also, I think, a moment of reflection for us as a movement, you know, because within this moment, actually, there's great possibility as well for us to move from both a defensive fight to actually an offensive fight. And so there are some really big questions that our movement needs to answer. And they're the same questions, I think, that the climate movement asks itself about the climate change. And it's the same questions we need to ask in the much broader context, you know, power, you know, why do they have it? Why haven't we got it? You know, and how did they get it? And who have they worked with to get it? You know, audiences, you know, who are the people they're speaking to? You know, and why aren't those people attracted to us, even though so much of that narrative and our solutions benefit those same people who are attracted to the far right? You know, we know that the part of the extreme right-wing nationalism we're seeing at the moment is about anti-globalization, and it's about elites. Well, our solutions are about tackling the elites and bringing community energy. So why aren't people coming to us in terms of those solutions? What's their frame and narrative that's out there? And how do we, and what does that say about us? You know, is it because we are in our own comfort zones? Are we in our own echo chambers? Are we not speaking to people? And why aren't we speaking to people? And I think that's big questions about frames and narratives. And we just touched on about polar bears and climate change. You know, you talk within working class communities about polar bears, you're not going to get anywhere, right? You talk about warm homes, you talk about things that matter to people. That's important. And there's lessons for us from how the far right build in communities. You know, it's always been true that the far right, when they're built, have never built on we're coming in with fascism. What they've built on is broken lifts and broken windows and neglect. And they've come and they've embedded themselves in those communities on those kind of issues. And we have to recognize, of course, that we're in a moment of multiple crises: climate, inequality, neoliberalism, extreme far right. And of course, they all compound each other. So trying to resolve one without thinking about how each reinforce each other is also problematic for us. And so I think the idea of simply going back into our silo and believing that the answer to climate change could be resolved without the answering the problems of inequality or the global economy as it is just not possible. So even from a climate perspective, it requires us to take those steps. And of course, for an intersectional movement, there are big questions about what is strategic, right? And how do you build a movement that, you know, complements itself? So rather than when it does actions, it reinforces and amplifies a message and a frame, and how we can have some transformational fights. And what are they and how are they really important? And I think, of course, we're seeing some in the United States with the water protectors and Dakota Access Pipeline, where people are saying that's a fight. And it's not just a climate fight. Actually, it's a fight around indigenous rights. It's a fight around land. It's a fight around water. But winning it makes us all win. And I think some of that is about the movement needs to think about. Now, practical things that we need to do. Look, first and foremost, you know, we have to oppose the far right electorally. Now, people say, well, what does that mean? You know, I always hear some people say, well, you know, isn't it just neoliberals versus other neoliberals? Look at Donald Trump and see what he's achieved in just 25 days and tell me that having the far right in power doesn't make a difference. Of course, it makes a huge difference. And so I think what we've got to, of course, say, not just passively, but actively say, people need to engage, people need to vote against the far right. And whether that means hold your nose and vote for somebody that you don't want to, yes. And then ask ourselves the question, why is the choice between the neoliberal and the far right? And why isn't there another alternative there instead of that dichotomy between those two? And I think it means, as a climate movement, being really bold. Look, as Friends of the Earth here in the UK, we were a founder member, we've set up Stop Trump Coalition. The protests that have been called, Friends of the Earth have called them. Now, we've done that because we think it's important for an environment movement to be there. We say it's absolutely critical because we're legitimate. We speak to an audience of people that the Muslim organisations, the refugee organisations, those on the front line can't speak to. We give a platform, so we can do that. We've got resources. Us siding with small grassroots organisations allows the potential of that movement to grow. So we've done that, and that's been a longer trajectory of work that we've done. In the recent Brexit referendum, and in the elections before, we take a strong position. We do a lot of local work where we have politicians on platforms, hustings and things like that. We take a position, no far right on there, but also we take a position, no UKIP, no right-wing nationalists on there. And we convince our own supporters and members why it's important, because we make the argument that we will not allow the normalization of this kind of racism and pretend that somehow, you know, it's okay as long as they're talking about stopping dirty energy, that was all right as well. Because as long as they ticked our agenda, it didn't really matter how obnoxious they were or extremist, racist they were on other. And that brings me, I think, to the question about ideology, right? You have to have zero tolerance to the far right. We used to say in days gone by, you know, you have to no platform the fascists, right? And what that meant is you don't allow them a toehold, because when you look back through history about how the far right gain ground, and look at around us now, the language, the aesthetics of the far right, they talk about it as the alt-right, but look at how they managed to do that. They dominate, you know, online and offline. They create drop boxes with far right memes. That means that it's not just, it's up to some people to oppose it. It's up to all of us to be saying, we don't allow it to happen, right? And that means shutting down and opposing people. When you see comments, you open any newspaper now and you look at the online comments, and the online comments are full of racists and right-wing trolls. And most of us just say, I can't be asked, and click and shut. You go on Facebook pages and they post memes and we say, that's not for me, and we shut. Actually, we need to start to challenge them. We need to post alternatives. We need to start arguing, because there are a lot of people who aren't speaking with us, who are looking at that, and in this weird world we live in, are drawing information and think that that is facts. And so they're creating this alternative facts to become reality. And that's a challenge for us, because if you allow that, then of course it undermines everything that we're doing as well. And so not allowing it to be normalized, I think, is really, really important. But it's not just important online, I think offline as well. And look, I don't want to sound like a history, but there are a lot of history about, you know, about how fascism grew in Europe in the 30s, how it got a toehold in the 70s, about what is the necessity of what for anti-racists and anti-fascists to be able to do. And that really does mean like opposing them, not allowing them to become part of the everyday discussion. And I don't think it's an accident that, for example, Le Pen was given, you know, a spot on the UK's premier news channel and political discussion program on the very same day as Armistice was. We were celebrating or marking the end of the Second World War and defeat of fascism, and that was just totally normal, because we've normalised the Le Pen and the far right now, like we normalise UKIP. And so the border of what is acceptable suddenly changes. And I think part of that is also about our consciousness. we have our own job to make sure we're educated and we're conscious and knowledgeable about our own history. If you speak with many young activists, we think that there is no history, right? We've been here before and we defeated them. We defeated them in the 30s and the 70s. There's been moments like this. There's a lot for us to learn from that, from our generations that have gone by, of what happened and what was successful, but also what didn't happen and what wasn't successful, so we don't repeat those mistakes again. But just remember, we create history, right? We create society. So this idea that this is just goes on around us and we're passive. No, if we engage, we can shape and determine those facts. And then I think we have to look. There's an opposing the far right and the fascists, and like, you know, whether it's Trump and his agenda or whatever, physically with our bodies. Now, there are communities who are on the front line, whether you're lesbian and gay, you're transgender, whether you're women and black, migrant, Muslim, you're facing those sort of everyday situations, or whether it's like the ban in the airports. It's important that there is solidarity to that. Now, some people will say, I'm happy and willing to be at the front line when communities don't have a choice, because of course, many times communities don't have a choice to protect themselves in that moment. But even if that's not where you want to be, your presence makes a difference, because it makes a difference whether 1,000 people oppose this or 10,000 people oppose this. Because when you're 10,000 people, you create the feeling that we are the movement, and 100,000 will follow. If it's 1,000 and 9,000 of us sitting in our armchairs saying, I'd like to be on there, but I'm busy with something else, we're allowing these people to dominate. And that goes back to the sort of the physical no platforming, that, you know, some communities and some won't have a choice, right? I've lived in communities growing up in Lancashire, where we grew up simply under siege as a black community. And when I was growing up, my parents told me that we should always be prepared to be kicked out of this country, that one day they will kick us out of this country. And as a young teenager, we said, no, never. We organized anti-racist groups. We said, here to stay, here to fight, we will resist, you know. And recently, that same feeling has started to happen in our communities again. People like, we're not going to survive this, are we? There's pressure growing, we're going to be forced to leave. And simply the fact, the scale of the protest that you've seen has made a big difference in confidence inside communities, because people have just said, you know, hold on a minute. When you saw that sign that said they came for the Muslims, and I said, not today, motherfucker. That sign, you don't know how many times it was shared within the Muslim community. It was incredible. I saw it so much because people went, oh, look, it's not just us opposing this. Mainstream society is saying we're not going to allow this darkness to happen. That's, I think, a very, very important thing. And it brings us to the question about solidarity. And look, we are where we are because, you know, the far right have managed to demonize migrants, refugees, and the Muslim community. And that's happened again and again, day in, day out, drip, drip, drip. And it's happened because of our media and our politicians. So there are, you know, and they're playing this race card, and it was inevitable that once you play the race card, it results in physical attacks. That's at the far end of the extreme, but it also changes the political conversation. People said to me, well, you know, you were very active in the anti-racist movement in the 80s and 90s and 70s. Didn't you smash the far right? And now I ask myself, well, is what we did, we just made it not possible to be racist in public, and have the politicians given people confidence to be racist again? And if so, you know, how did we allow them to push back so much at this moment? And that, I think, means that we have to really stand and take on this narrative about Islamophobia and migration. And I think there's another thing that we've got to do, which is, you know, when people talk about the far right, they talk about the far right as if it's like, oh, isn't that just the lumpen white working class? That's the uneducated white working class over there, as if it's those people who are the responsible. Look at the far right. Actually, the far right are educated. They're in the student movement. They're professionals. They're the middle classes. And that's what drives a lot of the far right. And so the idea that somehow it's not within our part of society, it's in somebody else's part of society, I think is also something we have to take on and challenge. And there are very practical things we can do around that. Look, you know, there's an exercise that we did many years ago, that if you took the Daily Mail, which is one of the most popular newspapers in the UK, and if you put the headlines of today about against the migrant community and the Muslim community, and then you put the headlines from the 1970s against the Asian community, then you put the headlines from the 1930s against the Jewish community, it's exactly the same headlines from exactly the same newspaper saying exactly the same thing. We're the problem, taking our jobs, not, you know, all the sort of racist tropes. And what are we doing about it? Well, we can say we don't buy the newspaper, but actually we have to be much more active. We have to take on the people who are advertising in the Daily Mail. We have to start saying to companies, if you are starting to prop up this by advertising, we're going to oppose you. We're going to challenge you, whether it's online, not buying things from them. I think we have to start making the things that make them respectable and able, start to challenge them. And the same on politicians, whether it's on local and I'm going to finish now. You know, for politicians as well, we allow politicians to say so much and allow it to happen, and then we're shocked when, you know, Donald Trump says that. But Donald Trump has been built in on, you know, sort of decades of this kind of racism. Now, I want to just finish on the final thing, which is about the bigger project, right? Because that's our defensive fight, and our offensive fight is, you know, what is our vision, right? And I think this has been one of the problems of our movement, is we've not been able to articulate a vision that is understandable and accessible. And at that core of that vision, I think, is a fight about justice, which is why you have to be able to, from a climate perspective, this is a really important fight, because unless we build a movement around justice, we don't get the power to even win on climate, because we need a big justice movement to build a climate justice movement. So I would say it's not simply you're ignoring climate to build another movement. We're actually building the movement that allows us to win on climate, because even if it's practical things, the frontline communities in Europe, migrant and refugee community, they're the communities that have been most impacted on by climate change. But they're not going to speak to you about climate change, because at the moment they're going to be worrying about the far right and migration and all of those things. Engaging with them and where people are helps us also build that constituency that we need. I'll end there. Oh, there's a question. Can you refer to sometimes and how you do?
Yeah, I said, yeah, don't worry. That's one of the comments. We've had so many kind of comments and questions that have been coming in. What you've been saying has been really great and helpful. We're running slightly over, and I'm really conscious that you have to go in a few minutes. So I'd just like to start people thinking about suggestions for things that we can do. So the kinds of things that we'd group those suggestions into were thinking about how you can educate yourself. So I will share a load of resources in the blog with people. I shared Naomi Klein's comment piece, and it's good to educate yourself about historical successes in this kinds of thing, as well as just, you know, the kind of the roots of this struggle and how these things are interconnected. And then there's a question for Asad about learning from the kind of successes that we've had in fighting the far right before. The sort of small steps that you could take could be writing to your local paper about your concerns, getting involved with anti-Trump protests, and looking at giving money to kind of local refugee or international refugee projects, and kind of bigger commitments like connecting with groups working locally on race, migration and refugee issues, supporting what they're doing, and opposing the rise of the right where you are, perhaps electorally, bringing it into your climate work, highlighting connections between the fossil fuel industry and right-wing politicians. You need to do some research for that, talking about climate impacts, how those in the global south are feeling things more, talking about pollution and those sorts of things where people across Europe are suffering from things more. Those are some of our ideas. I'd love to hear yours if you could write them into the chat box. And I'm just going to put this out to Asad just before we have to go, and then Nico, if you have any suggestions about the ideas for actions, like concrete actions people could take, or if you wanted to respond to anything else before you go, Asad.
Well, if you're in the UK, on the 20th of February next week, you know, is the big Stop Trump protest outside Parliament. the 2 million people who've signed the petition to calling on the UK government to withdraw state visit. You know, the government said, no, we're going to ignore you. There's a debate in Parliament. I think it's really, really important that we see a huge mobilization of people. This has got to be like the protests we saw against the war in Iraq, you know, on that scale. And we made a big impact. That's what we've got to do. We've not got to allow this normalization. So whether it's Donald Trump, if he comes into your country, he has to be met by huge protests. But that is not just about them over there, like the United States over there. We've got to pivot back and to hold up Trump as a mirror to our own countries and say what's wrong there and why are our own far-right parties growing. And so I would say, you know, use the Trump anger, because I think it's swept all across Europe, but pivot it back to our own countries. And then I think it's very much in terms of us as a climate movement, doing the very practical things that you said. If we want to talk about climate, let's talk about air pollution. That talks about inequalities. Let's talk about, you know, educating our own communities around, you know, climate and its impacts and how our consumption, our banks, are driving migration, because global inequality, how we're on, you know, an average of $55,000 per capita if you're in the United States, but on $700 if you're in Mali. Why climate change is collapsing 50% of agricultural yields there. Why droughts are displacing 3.5 million people. What does an economic migrant mean? You think, right, that's not about people wanting a better salary. That's about people wanting the right to a life, to a dignified life. And what kind of world do we want? And I think it starts to begin to have those conversations. And I'm a great believer that actually ordinary people connect with and have huge empathy. And we saw that, I think, during the so-called refugee crisis last summer and the summer before, when ordinary people all across Europe, even in places where people said, oh, there'll never be any solidarity, in Central and Eastern Europe, where people said there were so many other challenges, ordinary people came out and showed real solidarity. And that has to be where we have to start building from and say, that's the glimmer, because it's the same values that are going to help us tackle the climate crisis. And that's what we've got to reinforce.
Amazing, thanks, Asad. I don't know, you need to go now, right? So maybe we should say goodbye to you, or do you want to stay on until you actually need to go? It's totally up to you.
How long is this one?
I don't know how long we'll go for, like maybe another 10-15 minutes, but do feel free to leave if you need to.
No problem.
Okay, cool. All right, in that case, Nico, I would like to invite you to come in.
Yeah, maybe a few quick comments on the question, how do we make this not just about Trump? How can we be offensive? And which is also another question that has been asked, how do we make this fight not just global but local? And I would take 3 examples. The first one is the issue of heat waves. There was a huge heat wave in the summer of 2003 or 2004 in France. Like 15,000 people died during 3 weeks, more than usual, because of the heat. And when you look at the figures of who died, you realize that the people who died most are the people living in popular neighborhoods, because they are lonely. There's much more isolation. They don't have, and they live in buildings where the elevator doesn't work any longer, so they couldn't, go downstairs and buy water, whatever, or have some visits. And also because of the bad insulation of the houses. And the other people who died first were, of course, people working outside, like building roads. And which means that's a very good example of intersection. So poor people and workers died more of the heat wave than people like me, working in an office as climate organizers. So there's first clear inequality when it comes to something that appears, in theory, as touching everyone the same way. Well, it doesn't. So the first approach is to say, okay, when there's a heat wave, how can we organize to make sure that the people who suffer the most from it don't have to suffer that much, and B, of course, that they are not invisible, because it took months to realize that people were not equal facing the heat wave. Same goes with air pollution that Asad mentioned, and that's where, for instance, the notion of environmental racism is very useful, because then you realize that it's not because of fate that people suffer from air pollution more than others. It's because where they are born, who they are, where do they live. So it really has to do with that intersection between the class, the race, the gender, and the climate. So starting from those issues and trying to build them as not being just related to climate, not related only to air pollution, not related only to heat waves, but to social issues, to racial issues, is important. And the third example that I want to take, and which is a very concrete example for France, you might know that these days in France there's a huge rising mobilization against police violence, because a young black guy was raped by the police. The police used a baton and raped him with a baton, and he's of course very well, he won't die because of it, but he's really injured. And so there's a mobilization that started. And based on the blog that we wrote, we had a discussion and said, okay, we need to support the mobilization against police violence, even if it's not related to climate, because that's important to start from those fights, to build those intersections. And why is police violence also something that has to do eventually with climate? Well, just before the COP, you remember the COP21, the COP happening in Paris, you remember that there were the terror attacks. And just after the terror attacks, François Hollande decided to install a state of emergency. And some people from the climate movement we were working with that were very important to our mobilization were under house arrest. Marches were banned. And so the space to mobilize narrowed down. And then when we got to talk with people from popular neighborhoods, they said, well, that's nothing new to us. This is exactly what we do experience on a daily basis. So, hey, okay, you discover those issues. You want to fight against police repression. You want to fight against a state of emergency. And you want us to join. Fine. But where were you when we were fighting against police violence that was affecting us? So this has to do with our own fight. This has to do with everyone's fight. And this is, again, where it's important to acknowledge and remember that an infringement against one right is an infringement against everyone's rights and all rights. So yes, at first glance, maybe fighting against police violence in France these days has nothing to do with climate. But as Assad said, if we manage to fight against police violence, then we will reinforce the struggles for climate justice.
Thanks, Nico. Thank you. We are kind of running over time. We've got loads of great kind of comments and points coming in, and it looks like the conversation has been really fruitful. Yeah, this is just the beginning of this conversation with us. I'm going to try and pull a lot of your comments and thoughts into the blog that I write as well. There are a few more things that I wanted to say before we finish this call. So there's a few things that really helped me when the Muslim ban happened and all of the big protests kicked off. There were lots of things being shared on social media. I guess I was starting to feel quite panicked. It was quite tricky. One of my colleagues in the States has made this incredible resource, Finding Steady Ground. I will share that in the chat, or if somebody else, if one of my colleagues could while I'm speaking, that would be great. So yeah, I would just encourage you to think about what's driving you right now. And is it panic at the urgency of the situation with the rise of the right, or is it a grounded sense of the need for a just and sustainable future with wisdom about the best role that you can play? So I've been panicked. I'm excited and heartened by all the resistance, but I have been panicked. And the advice that was in this resource really helped me step back, take some kind of deep breaths and think about where I could best put my energy. Because yeah, this is, I mean, like Assad was saying, these fights have been, these fights have been won before. History's not decided, it all hangs in the balance, but it's going to be a marathon, not a sprint. We need to be in this for the long haul, and we need people to be sustaining themselves so that they can make the effort that's needed. So think about, I would really encourage you all to take a look at that resource and have a think about the advice that's in it. See if there's stuff there that resonates for you. I'll be putting that in the blog, and there'll be a link to it in the email tomorrow as well. There's things like thinking about where you get your news from, what you do after you get your news. maybe buddying up with someone to talk about the kind of actions that you're taking and find a way forward. And the second point that I wanted to make is that this is a time of great change. I think what we're seeing is the failing of the old economic system that started with the global financial crisis, and we're witnessing the birth of a new one. And it's a crossroads. It's an uncertain time. Opinions are massively divided. People's opinions are pulling in two different directions, but that shouldn't necessarily be feared. In times of great change globally, the voices on both sides of the debate get louder, and the debate gets more polarized as the battle rages for popular consensus and the path that will ultimately be taken. But this is a necessary stage. It's an uncomfortable stage, but it's a necessary stage for the kind of transformational change that we need. Doesn't mean that we should embrace shouting at each other. We need to find energy to disagree with each other with love and compassion, but this conflict can be a force for good if it's non-violent and it's well-grounded. And it's really important to stand with those that are most affected and to resist. Also, this is a big one. Another point that I wanted to make is about spreading fear. Let's not spread fear. We need to reduce this and the behaviours that contribute to it. I've been guilty of sharing on social media things that I've read and that have scared me. And people are sharing things that are not necessarily true, not well thought out, and having knee-jerk reactions. Ground ourselves, think about the stuff we're sharing, share stuff that is hopeful and successful, and yes, reach out when we need support, but don't kind of perpetuate the kind of infection of fear, because that's not a good place to be acting from and to be going forwards from. And this one's really important for me and lots of activists or people who campaign on anything. Don't try and do everything. So don't burn yourself out. Think about what it is you can add to the fight, what you're best placed to do and what you have energy to do. And you're not always going to have energy to do all the things, and that's fine. Everyone is different. Like, we all kind of go through seasons of how much we can engage. So rest when you need to rest, act when you feel like you can act. And we need an ecology of approaches, from insider lobbying to petitions to positive stories to cutting edge research to protest. What are you in a position to do? And yeah, there are lots of different protests that, like the rise of Trump and his election and the things that he's doing, have kicked off protests all over. And spawning from that, there's all sorts of other things coming out in your countries. It would be great if you could share ideas for the kinds of actions people could take in this chat. It will stay open after the call finishes, and we'll still be putting those things together, and also on Twitter. Yeah, so the final kind of the things I wanted to leave everybody with are, I would like to ask you to commit to kind of taking this forwards. This is the start of the conversation. I don't know how exactly it's going to go forwards, but we're committed to taking it forwards. I'll write an email tomorrow, we're going to write a blog, and there'll be more thoughts go into it. But could you go away and either with your group, if you have a group of people that you take action with on climate change, or just a friend, a buddy, if you don't have a group that you work with, think about which of the behaviours in the Finding Steady Ground resource would help you stay active and effective, and see if you can commit to check in with your friend or group weekly on how you're doing with those. And also, how can you, in your climate campaigning and in your life, tackle the rise of the right? Which of the suggestions we've discussed or the ideas you've seen can you take on, remembering to focus your energy and take care of yourself? And then when the blog is posted, I'll invite you to kind of start sharing some of those, and we want to continue the conversation as we go forwards. We're over an hour now. I think Assad definitely needs to leave, but I'd like to go to first to Assad and then to Nico to get any kind of final thoughts before we close. Assad, are you still there?
Yeah, I am. Can you hear me? Or have I disappeared? I seem to have disappeared. Oh no, I'm still here. And I just wanted to say, thank you for the opportunity. I think you're very right. We're building a movement. We're on a journey, and this journey is about, it needs all of us. But it's and we're building a movement whose beating heart has to be justice. We've been here before. We can fight and we can win. And more importantly than winning, we can win and create something better, and that's what we should do. It's not about defending the status quo. It's actually about defeating this and providing an alternative.
Thanks, Assad. Nico? Nico, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. I think at this stage, I really just want to say and commit from my end to make sure that this is just a beginning, that it's not one shot like webinar and then we go back to our daily work, you know, saying, okay, we have done our duty and paid our, like, we've had our share in building that intersectional movement, but that we really do and find ways to move that conversation ahead, and find concrete ways to, like, in our daily mobilization, campaigning work, etc., do that. First step would be definitely, as you both said, bringing those conversations to our own national spaces, because the context is different. And for instance, it was thrilling to see, you know, many positive comments to the English version of the blog post, and actually very tough and harsh comment in the French version of the blog post, because, like, the French movement and the French progressive field is colorblind and religion blind. So to many people, it's not an issue. So I think, like, in France, it's really, like, contributing to make it an issue. And yeah, so it's just the beginning.
Great, thanks so much, everyone. I'm going to close it there because we're over an hour. Thank you all for staying with us. And yeah, I think that we're all committed to taking this forwards. And so I will be in touch with you again. Thanks to Nico and Assad and to my other colleagues that have been supporting this behind the scenes. And thanks so much to all of you. Please do keep sharing your ideas in the comments after we close. And yeah, this is definitely to be continued.